One more minute, and then we'll come back together. Okay. If I could have your attention, in the document packet, after the last primary document, there's a chart that your students can use, and how you organize the learning, whether you jigsaw it and have each table become experts in one of the documents or not. But ask students to use this chart to identify the documents that support a living constitutionalist approach and the documents that support an originalist approach. Of course, we're going to go around and kind of share what each one of our primary documents say about how we should interpret the Constitution. But this is a way that students could organize that information. And in the documents that we're uploading to our Google site, it has some responses. So for the first one, for William Marbury, it has, not Marbury. Thank you. There's a teacher's guide in there as well, but let's start with that. So the first document, Chief Justice Marshall, what does he say about the Constitution's adaptability? Or what did you all, how did you answer that question?
Well, the first sentence of the quote says, the Constitution is intended to endure for all ages to come. So that itself, to me, would say that it's kind of that. This need to come out.
Okay.
Yeah, it says, and consequently to be adapted to various crises and human affairs. So it says,
And so if he's saying that the Constitution has to adapt, then does that mean, is that an originalist approach or a living Constitution approach? What's that? A living, okay.
Yeah, I mean, it said at the bottom here, it would have been an unwise attempt to provide immutable rules of exigencies. And I take that to mean a very, very detailed, long, lengthy Constitution that addresses every possible scenario. A document like that would be impossible, so this was created using intentionally vague language so that it can be interpreted as society and technology advances.
Good. Any other comments? That reflects what I have here. I have the Constitution must be adapted to new crises and problems. The framers couldn't have foreseen all potential problems, and they necessarily wrote an adaptable document. How about Attorney General Meese?
Our competition, and this is my interpretation of it, is we're both fairly moderate in our view, but if there was a direct line drawn between the two positions, I would be just on the Scalia side, and he would be more just on the Breyer side, but we both agree about the document. We just disagree on our ability to interpret it accurately. I see it, the Constitution, as like the bumpers, the bowling alley that they pull up for the kids, that keep the ball in the lane. And that's how I see the Constitution, is keeping us in the lane. As soon as the ball starts to go outside the lane, that's when the justices say, no, you can't go outside these boundaries. But what happens inside the lane is the Constitution just defines, hey, stay in this lane. And then the will of the people is expressed through the legislature, through the laws that are created. If those laws go outside the lane, then the Constitution says, no, you can't do that. And this is often come out through yes. I'm sure he suggested that
And Scalia was appointed in 86? Yeah, so 86, and this was in 85, and so it shows that similar way of thinking. Sure. I'm not gonna go there. Yeah, he said the framers chose their words carefully and debated minute points at great length. How about Chief Justice Rehnquist?
He basically says that justices are appointed, and he feels that social problems should be addressed by
Which also is similar to what Scalia said, in that if people want to change this, or if people don't like this, then it's up to legislatures and elected bodies to do that, not up to a court to make that decision. Yeah, he says, however socially desirable the goals sought to be advanced, advancing them through a freewheeling, non-elected judiciary is quite unacceptable in a democratic society. So far that's Marshall on the side of a living constitution approach. Meese and Rehnquist err on the side of an originalist approach. How about, well, Justice Stephen Breyer? Anything new in this document, or anything that either supports what he said in the video or that's slightly different than what he said in the video?
Consider the documents that value
Okay.
Your history often fails to provide specific objective directions. And sometimes these are the protections exactly word for word.
the fact that meaning of phrases might have changed or be different with us now than then. We want our students to, think about that and bring that in. Due process means something different now than then.
Yeah. And what a well-regulated militia in 1787 looked like compared to today, and what bearing arms in 1787 meant compared to today. Well, and these, yeah. All right, one last document. Justice William Brennan.
We picked two things out of here, clearly living. He says it's arrogant to pretend that from our vantage we can gauge accurately the intent of the framers on the application of principles to specific contemporary questions. And he goes on to say the ultimate question must be what do the words of the text mean in our context? So the meanings of the Constitution are not on any static meaning we might have had in the world that is dead and gone, but we can evaluate great principles of both current problems.
Yeah, yes, go ahead.
I think it's interesting that Marshall was like, I went to the Supreme Court once and they got a big statue, right? He's the only one that was huge statue sitting there. And he's a living constitutionalist, right? And that's what one of those person asked him was, right? He invented the whole concept of judicial review. Almost like Scalia is like having to fight with him to prove it these ways, almost or something like that. That would be an argument I want to see. Because, Marshall's a great justice.
Yeah.
All out now. Well, yeah, it was
Yes.
So in the Code versus Maryland, they didn't let the states be able to tax the bank, right? Right, so they destroyed it. That seems like an intent of the founders coming from, when they wrote it, to make a stronger sense of purpose. He's a federalist. It also seems like an originalist
Okay, so to go back to the beginning, we have we have a justice on the Supreme Court that dies. We've got 8 justices on the court. We have a president who has expressed the commitment and desire to appoint a justice before his term of office ends. We have the Senate chairman of the Judiciary Committee saying that the Senate committee will not consider any proposal made by the president. It's complex, it's heated and emotional, and it's at times like this when I wish I was teaching high school students and not the college students that I have, just because I'm teaching them how to be teachers and you're teaching your students how to engage in this conversation. And it's an important conversation to engage in. So as we look at these documents, we've got documents on both sides, from prominent justices on the Supreme Court from both sides who argue one or the other. We've got events that are going on in the United States currently, as in 2 or 3 days ago, involving issues that people interpret quite differently as they relate to the Constitution with the events that occurred, the recent shooting and debates about gun control and so on and so forth. And what I like to do after this conversation where the students dig into the documents, they look at what justices have said through time, there still isn't an answer. Well, there isn't, everybody's got an answer, but in terms of the answer. And I like to take them to one more case, and this is where we're focusing on one particular case. And in the documents, the document packet that you'll have that I uploaded, it has a brief of this case with the background, with the dissenting, or excuse me, with the majority opinion and the dissenting opinion, and it's written in a user-friendly way. But I want to take a look at this case of Roper versus Simmons. I'm going to show you about a 3-minute video on C-SPAN that summarizes what's going on in the case. And then in the document packet that you have, where it says handout 4, it says evaluating opinions. After we watch this short video clip, I'm going to ask you to read through those 5 statements and say whether or not the statement you're reading reflects an originalist approach or a living Constitution approach. And on the back side of handout 4, there's an alternate. It's kind of differentiated for readiness for students who aren't quite ready to read the complex description that actually came from the case. And so it's just kind of tiered down a little bit. So let's see a 3-minute video on the facts of the case, and then we'll break out again and look at those quotes. Hold your breath. What do you think? I'm going to reload it. We'll try one more time, and then we'll just move on if we have to.
Montgomery, Alabama is Kevin Newsom, who is the Solicitor General of the state of Alabama. Mr. Newsom, why is this case coming before the Supreme Court? Important, and what is it?
Well, the case is called Roper versus Simmons, Connie. It's coming before the U.S. Supreme Court. The Missouri Supreme Court decided several months ago that notwithstanding a 1989 decision from the U.S. Supreme Court holding that the execution in appropriate circumstances of individuals who had committed the crime of capital murder when they were 16 or 17 did not violate the Eighth Amendment. Notwithstanding that decision, the Missouri Supreme Court held that societal standards had evolved in the intervening 15 years and that now it does violate the Eighth Amendment. The court took the case to review that decision of the Missouri Supreme Court.
Did we the first time that they are doing a death penalty case on juveniles since when?
Since 1989, the case there was called Sanford versus Kentucky.
And Shay Milchick is joining us in our studio here in Washington. He's the president and CEO of Child Welfare League of America. Mr. Milchick, tell us a little bit about, good morning, tell us a little bit about this gentleman, Mr. Simons.
Simmons was a juvenile at the time this offense occurred. It was a horrible case, murder, and there's no question about the fact that there needs to be a severe punishment in this case. The real question, though, is in the evolving sense of decency around how we punish juveniles. Is the juvenile death penalty appropriate for someone who committed a crime at the age of 17 or younger?
What do you mean by evolving?
Well, what happened back in '89 was the Supreme Court said, look, if it's an offender under the age of 16, it simply is not appropriate punishment to execute that individual. Now we need to look at what's happened in the past 15 years in terms of the opinion across the country, what we know about the development of youth, their brain development, their capacity for making decisions at maturity level, and whether this is still good law. That's why the Supreme Court created this case. Take another look at that capacity issue of these defendants, whether the death penalty is appropriate, or whether it is indeed cruel and unusual punishment.
Mr. Nixon, is it the Supreme Court's role to look at an evolving issue of how America feels about something when they look at a case?
Well, that is, Connie, how the Supreme Court has set up this area of jurisprudence, and it's distinct really from the way the court approaches many other constitutional issues. Typically, we would be talking about what the Eighth Amendment says, how the Eighth Amendment was originally understood, the history of the construction of the Eighth Amendment. In this area of the law, the court has set it up somewhat differently, and the test coming out of a case called Trope versus Dulles is whether or not the punishment squares with the evolving standards of decency in society. So typically the answer to your question is no. In this area of the law, I think the answer, at least under current doctrine, is yes.
Our guest from Montgomery, Alabama, is Kevin Newsom.
Okay. And just in case I forget, there's a YouTube video that I didn't link here, and I can go back and add it, but there's a YouTube video where Breyer and Scalia talk about this particular case, and they obviously disagree on the ruling. Just, are people familiar with, and I think I kept saying Roper versus Illinois, and I don't know why, but are you familiar with this case? I'll read you a little bit of the facts. I have, like I said, I have this brief for you. In September 1993, Christopher Simmons broke into the suburban St. Louis home of Shirley Crook with intention to rob and possibly kill her. Simmons and a friend tied the victim up with duct tape and drove her to a nearby state park. At the park, Simmons pushed the victim, who was still alive, off a bridge into the Merrimack River, where she drowned. Simmons was 17 years old at the time of the murder. Before the crime, he had told several of his friends of the plan to burglarize a home and kill the occupants, noting that they could do it and get away with it because they were juveniles. Simmons and his friends were arrested the following day, and Simmons confessed on videotape at a police station. He even agreed to reenact the crime on videotape and returned to the park and demonstrated where Mrs. Cook had been pushed from the bridge. At trial, the jury easily found him guilty. During the sentencing hearing, the defense attorney asked the jury to use Simmons' age and the fact that he had no prior convictions as mitigating factors and not give Simmons the death penalty. However, the jury focused on the brutal and aggravated nature of the crime and sentenced Simmons to death by lethal injection. Simmons' case was appealed, citing ineffective trial support. His age and thus impulsiveness, along with a troubled background, were brought up as issues. The trial court upheld the jury's death sentence. The Missouri Supreme Court upheld the conviction, and the U.S. Supreme Court denied review. Simmons' attempt at legal relief from the federal courts was also denied. However, in light of a 2003 Supreme Court ruling in Atkins versus Virginia that overturned the death penalty for a mentally disabled individual, the Missouri Supreme Court reconsidered Simmons' case. In an unusual move, the Missouri Supreme Court concluded that, quote, a national consensus has developed against the execution of juvenile offenders, end quote, and sentenced Simmons to life imprisonment without parole. The state of Missouri appealed the decision to the U.S. Supreme Court, and on January 26, 2003, the court agreed to hear the case, and that's where we're at. There's a couple of... What do they decide? Well, that's part of the fun of this exercise. We're going to find that out. Don't be mad at me. We're almost done. 9 minutes. So in handout 4, it says evaluating opinions. So the excerpts below come from Supreme Court justices in the case. Read each excerpt and decide whether or not it represents an originalist approach or a living Constitution approach. So let's take a couple minutes and go through each one of those statements and whether or not it represents original or living, and then we'll talk about the case. This is a great case to get teenagers talking about interpreting the Constitution, especially when we're looking at a 17-year-old. On March 1st, 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled by a vote of 5-4 that the use of death penalty for juvenile criminals is unconstitutional. The court determined that capital punishment for people who commit a crime before the age of 18 is in violation of the Eighth Amendment, which bans cruel and unusual punishment. Justice Kennedy issued the majority opinion, joined by Justices Breyer, Ginsburg, Souter, and Stevens. Scalia, Rehnquist, Thomas dissented, and Justice O'Connor dissented separately. Justice Kennedy supported the decision by referring to, quote, evolving standards of decency. Since 1989, 5 states that previously allowed the juvenile death penalty have banned its use. 30 states currently prohibit the juvenile death penalty, and in the past 10 years, only 3 states have executed prisoners who committed crimes as juveniles. Referring to the Atkins versus Virginia decision, Kennedy reiterated that, quote, it's not so much the number of these states that is significant, but the consistency of the direction of change, end quote. In the dissent, Scalia argued that there had not been a consensus about whether to execute juveniles or not. He noted that a very small number of states had shifted their position on the juvenile death penalty in recent years, hardly making this a marker of consensus. Further, the, quote, scientific and sociological studies, end quote, that find juveniles to be less capable of making reasoned decisions have not been proven to be methodologically sound. And other studies indicate that juveniles do possess the ability to make important moral decisions. Other laws that use 18 as the marker for important decisions are not relevant since, quote, serving on a jury or entering into marriage also involves decisions far more sophisticated than the simple decision to not take another's life, end quote. In her dissent, Justice O'Connor argued that there had not been conclusive evidence to show that a, quote, genuine national consensus, end quote, has emerged on prohibiting the juvenile death penalty. However, she agreed with Scalia's argument that the international community's stance on juvenile execution is irrelevant to the case, noting that a global consensus is an appropriate marker to gauge American standards of decency. I think that should say, noting that a global consensus is not an appropriate marker, or it is. I'm wondering if I have a typo there. What were your thoughts on the specific? Well, we've only got 4 minutes. Let me ask you this question. How do you have a conversation with your students about interpreting the Constitution without, how do you let them come to their own decisions, I guess, is my question for you. Do you let them come to their own decisions? At what point do you say to them, I think that this interpretation makes more sense than that interpretation?
Well, I think it's all about, having them make
Okay.
So several states have challenged, juveniles, that have committed murder, to pay if their brains are still in the developmental stages and they're overturning cases. Right, correct? Are they taking back off of this decision?
That's a good question. And I don't know the case law well enough to say which cases have and which cases
I've read
haven't.
several, like California, for example, juveniles are potentially able to appeal cases, for convictions and get a lesser charge.
Mhm. Well, I think this case certainly,
Iowa heading in that direction, or have they talked about that?
There was recently a case,
I would,
that went before the Iowa Supreme Court about a juvenile that killed his grandparents.
yeah,
How did that turn out?
Have they rendered a decision?
I don't think so.
So if they do, that would be,
Yeah,
Wow.
he has
I
life.
think there's more research being done in that field also,
Right.
so that might affect the
Yeah.
city as well. Because obviously in the case they were stating, the Supreme Court justices were stating that there wasn't sufficient.
Yes. And this is
So
2005.
as that research is being done, I think
I guess I follow that a bit. I went to the high school that we teach that. There was in my driver's ed class, a 15-year-old shot and killed another 15-year-old in my driver's ed. And I know that he's currently serving life in prison,
Mhm.
for secret murder, but he has, I follow, like, how that case has developed in time. He's appealed several times, but he's been denied appeal. So, that'd be
they may do that.
wow, he's appealed over the years, and he hasn't been able to.
Well, and this case certainly would establish a precedent for the death penalty, but whether or not this case supports the idea that you shouldn't, that a 16-year-old shouldn't spend their life in prison for a decision they made at 16, I think that's still up for debate, because there's no question that what this kid did. Apparently there were three young men who were at this, who made the decision to do this. One of the three young men fled when they got her to the bridge and said, "I'm not going to do this." And the other two were there, and this young man was the one who pushed her off the bridge. And so it's not a question as to whether or not he's guilty, and not a question whether or not he should be punished. In this case, it was a question of whether or not he should be executed. And between 2005 and 2006, in terms of the advancements in technology and what we know about the brain, that certainly would shape a decision that would be made. Okay, well, I'm out of time. So my goal for this 90 minutes was to take one particular approach, which is to focus on specific cases to teach thinking skills, thinking like a political scientist, using a current event with Scalia's death, and hopefully these are things that you can use pretty in your classrooms. But I'm done for now. Then I come back this afternoon. We're going to talk about executive orders this afternoon, and what we'll do is we're going to look specifically at specifically at Abraham Lincoln's decision to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. We're going to look at some primary documents and question whether or not, under what powers did Lincoln have to make those decisions as an executive order. And then we'll look at some other executive orders in history. And then what I'd like for us to do by the time we're done this afternoon is to maybe define some parameters. Under what circumstances do you think it's acceptable for a president to issue an executive order based on historical decisions, and then looking forward with current and future presidents, how far is too far? Okay. Thank you.